Joining me now for right versus left, we've got Benedict Spence. Thank you, Benedict, for on the show for the first time. And we've also got Matthew Stadlen, both political commentators.
No handshake for me, Lee.
No. There you go. There you go. That's okay. Look, this year we're going to have a general election, guys, and things are going to get a little bit nasty, a little bit heated. We've seen this week certain newspapers having a pop at Sir Keir Starmer and other political leaders. Yes, it's going to get nasty. Is it warranted, Benedict?
I mean, first and foremost, I'd be very impressed if it does go particularly far, because the two main leaders don't have much of a personality to take a pot shot at. See, I didn't waste any time there, actually just coming straight out of the blocks. Is it warranted? I think in lieu of policies that are landing, I think you'll see members of the press, other politicians reverting to this. And that's, I think, whether or not it's warranted is perhaps slightly beside the point. It's what works. And I think what you're seeing is both parties are actually slightly running scared of the electorate. The Labour Party haven't pushed any sort of major policies that sort of stick in their mind. They don't have to, because they're not the government and they're not under the most pressure. But the Tories, everything that they seem to push out at the moment doesn't seem to land particularly well beyond a certain base that's already going to vote for them. And I genuinely think actually a lot of this is because they're very concerned about the wrath of the public. The Tories, understandably, they've been in power for a very long time. Things haven't been going particularly well. I still think that the Labour Party are very sort of cautious post-Corbyn. Okay. I don't think they've got their sort of courage back. So it makes it a lot easier, I think, to just sort of take pot shots at the other side, because there's a lot to be taken.
Matthew, we look over the pond, as we say. We look at the American elections coming up. We see Trump filling football stadiums up, and he's sort of sometimes a bit of a one-trick pony with his speeches. It's all attacking Biden, and he does impressions of Biden, and basically takes the mick out of Biden. But it seems to work. Is that sort of creeping into our politics?
It undoubtedly is creeping into our politics, more than creeping into our politics, but I hope we turn our backs on it, because although Trump is obviously a very effective politician, we know that, he says terrible things about individuals, and politics should be depersonalised when it comes to those sorts of attacks. It's one thing to hold power to account, as I sort of religiously do on social media and on TV, but you can do it in a reasonable way that isn't vicious. Yeah. And I was concerned, actually, as someone who does want to see a Labour government. The other day, Keir Starmer said he was going to fight fire with fire, and he expects the Tories to go low. I hope that doesn't mean, but I worry that it does, that Labour will also go low. And we've seen some attack ads, actually, from Labour already on Sunak that I didn't like. And when I see that sort of stuff, I call it out. There's a lot of nastiness in British politics, and you see it on the hard left, you see it on the right, and unfortunately, you also see it on the centre left, and that's where I'm coming.
One of the consequences, though, Benedict, of the attack ads, and we have had some nasty attack ads from the Labour Party, it means that people like me, elected officials, get death threats and threats of violence and all sorts of nasty, horrible emails that come into the office.
I think there's been a bit of a breakdown in terms of how people view their MPs, not as representatives, but as sort of punchbags, if you like. And you'll always get some people who are very fixated and will keep on sort of harassing or being very angry because, their worldview isn't being met. And that's unfortunate, but you're always going to get that. But I do agree that there has been a breakdown in the relationship between the general public and how they view their MPs, which again, I think feeds into the reason why the parties are running scared. It is something that we need to break. And I think possibly political parties, therefore, don't do themselves any favour when they feed into this by perpetuating it. But it does sell. We are only human ultimately, and the drama does sell. That's we have to sort of be aware of this. It would be nice to see parties taking a step back, but I think you'd have to see some sort of cross-party consensus on this, because one party could very easily go, well, you guys, that's fine if you don't want to run attack.
It's funny you should say that, Benedict, because I tried that locally with one of my local opposition parties. It was not Labour Party, by the way, different. I tried that to have a truce on not slagging each other off, and but it lasted about a week.
You can only be responsible for yourself. You can only control what you yourself do.
Yeah, but sometimes, though, Matthew, when people put stuff out in the press and on posters, on leaflets, you have to fight back.
Well, you can hold them to account for it. You can call them out for it, but it doesn't mean you have to stoop to their level. You, as a politician, have a responsibility to lead the way. You're famous, aren't you, for saying what you think? You can say what you think without getting personal.
The most damaging one, I think, was when Labour were doing attack ads and campaigns on Tories have voted to dump sewage into waterways and seas, and we hadn't. We voted against an amendment which would have, if that amendment would have passed, Benedict, we would have seen sewage building up in the streets. You know, this is all about storm overflows. But the way they spun the message, it meant that we were getting death threats.
Again, though, this is about politics and the pursuit of power, and ultimately people consider anything fair game. If it's all very well saying, well, let's try and stick within the rules, but ultimately, if you are an ideologically bent politician and you have your worldview and you believe that that is what's going to fix everything, you will actually do. Lots of people will anyway. Do what they can to ensure that their worldview is what's exacted on people, and I think that's just part and parcel of having very determined individuals, very determined parties who see themselves almost as sort of utopian. Perhaps you get that slightly less with the Tories, but certainly on the left.
Let's take yesterday's Prime Minister's questions as an example. Rishi Sunak, who I think the majority of the public, whatever they think of on immigration and asylum, will feel that Rishi Sunak has failed on his own terms. And that's fine. That's not being personally abusive. But he then said that Keir Starmer was on the side of the criminal gangs. Now, that is a personal attack. It's obviously untrue, and it lowers the tone of debate. We have an election where this country, in my view, is in a mess. A lot of people think it's breaking or broken. There are massive issues at stake. Let's focus on the policies and, to an extent, the politics, but let's not hammer the individual.
So a lot of he said, she said here, Bennett, because just a few months ago, it was Sir Keir Starmer who said that Rishi likes to let paedophiles go and not put them in prison. That was another.
Exactly. It's six one, half dozen the other. And I think it's interesting, the whole thing about Rishi Sunak, because, of course, one of the lines that you get from the Labour Party quite a lot is that he doesn't get Britain. And that's because they paint him as sort of, being elitist, very well off, from a different kind of background. Whereas I think a lot of normal people would look at that as sort of an immigration story done well. Actually, he's something that you should be taking as a sort of a pin-up. Equally, when David Starkey said the same thing, which is that Rishi Sunak doesn't get Britain, the very same people who criticise Rishi Sunak for being out of touch accused Dr. Starkey of being a racist. It depends how you can spin the exact same line. So I do think that there's
a bit of a difference there. I mean,
there was.
If Labour are trying to paint Sunak as a public schoolboy, that's very different from painting him as not understanding Britain because he comes from an Asian background.
It's not public school, though, is it?
So you think Labour are being racist?
It's the fact that he has one foot in the United States. It's the fact that he has another foot in India. It is the perception, not in fact of racism, but of being more globalist. I don't think actually being a public schoolboy has anything to do with it. I think it's more to do with the fact that he has his view, and you see this in terms of what it is that he champions in terms of policies. Things like wanting people to do better at maths, because if you look at Southeast Asia, everybody is sort of drilled into it. I think that there is this idea that his horizons are broader than simply the bread and butter issues. But when David Starkey says the exact same thing, which is what he was saying, which is that he has a broadly internationalist view, people said, oh, well, that's a disgraceful thing to say. And it does seem to be, depending on who it is that says it, you are liberally allowed to interpret it.
You've got a point, Benedict. Surely he's got a point.
Look, and I want to be careful what I say because I can't exactly remember the exchange with Starkey. But my impression was that Starkey was making a point about Sunak's ethnic background. And I hope Labour have not done that. And if Labour were to do that,
they've got form for that.
Let me make my point. If Labour were to make any sort of dog whistle about Rishi Sunak's Asian background.
But they've done it. They did it with Suella. They did it with Priti. They have got form for this.
Do you remember the Guardian cartoons about Priti Patel?
Yes.
Which would have been absolutely hounded if it had been a right-wing newspaper about...
Look, what I'm calling for is standards in public life. And that is really important. Keir Starmer is talking about cleaning up public life. That was one of the things that the public were fed up with, I think, about the end of the John Major years. Do you remember sleaze, right? Starmer has got to try to reset our politics, but if he's going to be the man for that, he cannot go low. It's one thing being robust, but if fighting fire with fire means going low, then that loses my support. And I'm going to vote Labour, right? I'm not going to make any bones about that. But as someone who wants a Labour government, I'm going to call for them to behave with integrity and decency.
And if they don't, what will you do?
Well, I'll keep calling them out. And by the way, if we get if we get a Labour government, as a journalist and a political commentator, I will hold those guys to account.
I think the funny thing is, actually, I think Keir Starmer can't get away with going this low. I mean, it's interesting that we cited Donald Trump. He can sort of get away with it because he's naturally very entertaining.
Yes.
Another good example of that is obviously Boris, but Silvio Berlusconi was very good at it. Some politicians can actually be vile to their opponents and get away with it because people chuckle and they go, oh, what's he like? Whereas both Sunak and Starmer, I just don't think have that. So I think the public will be hotter on that sort of thing, and they'll look at it for what it is.
Could I just bring in social media here for a second?
Very quickly.
Because we know that social media can be a sewer. And it can set the tone, and it's really important for politicians to rise above that, but also for people such as ourselves in the public eye to call it out when we see it.
Okay, great, guys. That's absolutely, could have gone on all night, that, couldn't it? It was again a bit fruity at one stage.